There is a particular kind of story that history produces, only rarely one that arrives already complete, already overflowing with everything a story needs: holy war and financial genius, castles on cliffs above the sea and dungeons carved beneath the earth, warrior monks who took vows of poverty and somehow ended up owning half of Europe, a king who destroyed them out of greed so naked it barely bothered to dress itself in principle, a pope who let it happen out of a fear so deep it masqueraded as theology, and a set of mysteries that 700 years of scholarship and 10,000 amateur conspiracy theorists have never quite managed to put to rest. Tonight, we are going to tell that story. The story of the Knights Templar, an institution born on the streets of Jerusalem in the shattered aftermath of the First Crusade, grown into something so powerful and so strange that the medieval world could not quite decide whether it was a gift from God or a threat to everything God's world had built and then destroyed in a single Friday morning in October 1307, in one of the most audacious acts of state violence in the history of medieval Europe. This story has almost everything. It will take time to tell it properly, and we intend to tell it properly. The place to begin is not with the Templars themselves, but with the world that made them necessary. In July 1099, after 3 years of marching, starving, besieging, and dying across thousands of miles of unfamiliar territory, the armies of the First Crusade breached the walls of Jerusalem. What followed was a massacre of the city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants that contemporary sources describe with a combination of horror and theological satisfaction that tells you a great deal about the mental world of the people who committed it. The streets ran with blood. The Crusaders wept for joy. They believed, most of them sincerely, with the absolute conviction of men who had suffered enormously for a cause that they had accomplished the will of God. Then the leaders looked at one another across the rubble and the silence and tried to figure out what to do with what they had won. The answer they arrived at was the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a feudal state established in the heart of the Levant, ringed by enemies on every side, populated by a tiny Latin Christian ruling class governing a vastly larger Muslim, Jewish, and Eastern Christian population, and dependent for its survival on a steady supply of soldiers, money, and political will from a Western Europe that was very far away and had very short institutional memory. The supply was always uncertain. Crusaders came in waves, spent months or years in the Holy Land feeling righteous and sunburned, and then went home. The permanent military establishment of the Crusader states was chronically, dangerously, almost laughably understaffed for the task it faced. The roads were the most immediate and most visible symptom of this problem. The routes that pilgrims travelled from the coastal ports to the holy sites of Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth ran through territory that was neither fully controlled by Crusader forces nor safe from the bandits and remnant Muslim fighters who preyed on travellers with grim efficiency. A pilgrim who made the entire journey from Western Europe years of planning, months of sailing, the perpetual hazard of medieval sea travel, and then died on a dusty road within sight of the walls of Jerusalem, represented everything wrong with what the First Crusade had left behind. The victory had been real. The infrastructure to make that victory meaningful to ordinary Christian people was almost entirely absent. In the years immediately following the Crusade, the roads to Jerusalem were dangerous enough that organised pilgrim travel was effectively impossible for people without substantial armed escort. Wealthy lords could afford private soldiers. Ordinary pilgrims could not. The gap between the dream of Jerusalem, the holy city at the centre of the medieval Christian imagination, the place toward which every believer oriented their spiritual compass, and the lethal reality of the roads that led to it, was one of the foundational contradictions of the Crusader project. Nobody had solved it. Nobody had even tried to solve it in any systematic way. The Kingdom of Jerusalem's rulers were too busy simply surviving to address the problem of the roads with the institutional seriousness it required. The coastal ports were held. The major cities were garrisoned. The frontier castles were manned by whatever forces could be scraped together from the permanent population of Crusaders who had chosen to stay rather than return home. But the roads between those points, the roads were everyone's problem, which meant in practice they were nobody's problem. Merchants moved in armed groups when they could. Pilgrims huddled together and prayed that numbers would provide some deterrence. Sometimes they did. Often enough they did not. The bodies found on the road to Jerusalem in those early years of the 12th century robbed, killed, left for the dust were a daily reminder that the most celebrated military achievement of the Christian world had created a kingdom that could not protect the people it was supposed to serve. That contradiction, sitting at the centre of the Crusader project like a stone in a shoe, would eventually produce one of the most extraordinary institutional experiments in the history of the medieval world. But that experiment required someone to notice the problem clearly enough, and to care about it personally enough, and to possess the particular combination of conviction and practicality needed to attempt a solution that had never been attempted before. That someone was coming. He was riding out of the Champagne region of France, a minor nobleman of no great wealth, carrying an idea that was simple in concept and audacious in practice, an idea that would reshape the medieval world more thoroughly than almost anything that came before or after it. The road to Jerusalem was waiting, and so was history. His name was Hugh de Paynes, and history has not been particularly generous with details about him. He came from the Champagne region of France, a landscape of flat plains and vine-covered hills that produced some of the most capable knights of the early 12th century alongside some of its finest wine. He was a minor nobleman, not the kind of man whose birth commanded attention, not the kind whose wealth opened doors before he knocked. What he had instead was something rarer and more dangerous than either rank or money. He had been to Jerusalem. He had seen the roads. He had stayed when almost everyone around him went home. And in staying, he had absorbed the contradiction at the heart of the Crusader project, with the patience of a man who intended to do something about it. Around 1119, after years of living with the problem, Hugh de Paynes arrived at an idea. It was the kind of idea that sounds straightforward when you state it plainly and reveals its full audacity only when you consider what it required. He would gather a small group of knights who would take monastic vows, poverty, chastity, obedience, the three commitments that define the religious life across every tradition of Christian monasticism, and dedicate themselves not to prayer and contemplation, but to a military vocation. They would not sit in cloisters copying manuscripts and singing the divine office in warm candlelit rooms. They would patrol the roads. They would escort pilgrims. They would fill the gap that the Crusader state's chronic shortage of military manpower had left gaping and dangerous and filled with bodies. The idea combined two things that the medieval Christian world had always kept carefully: separate the sword and the monk's habit, and proposed to make them not merely compatible but spiritually identical. It was, depending on your theological perspective, either an inspired solution to an intractable problem, or a category error so fundamental it bordered on blasphemy. The Church had not yet decided which. That decision would come later, and it would change everything. Hugh approached Baldwin II, the King of Jerusalem, with his proposal. Baldwin, a pragmatic ruler who understood his kingdom's military situation with the clarity that comes from personal desperation, gave them quarters. The quarters he provided were housed in what the Crusaders believed was the site of the ancient Temple of Solomon, a tradition that almost certainly confused the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, which stood on the Temple Mount, with the mythical structure the Bible described in terms so magnificent that no actual building could quite live up to them. The error of identification did not trouble the Crusaders, whose relationship with the physical geography of Jerusalem was shaped more by theological inheritance than by architectural precision. What mattered was the name the location gave the new order. They called themselves the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. History, with its gift for compression, would call them the Knights Templar. The temple would follow them everywhere they went through their history, through their dissolution, through 7 centuries of legend and conspiracy and mythology that accumulated around their memory like silt around a sunken ship. For the first 9 years of their existence, the Templars were genuinely poor. Hugh de Paynes and the small group of knights who joined him, among them Godfrey de Saint Omer, whose importance to the order's early days is attested in several sources, and perhaps 7 or 8 others whose exact names and numbers the early records preserve, with the inconsistency of documents written by people who did not yet know they were recording the origins of something historic lived on charity, and the occasional donations of pious nobles who admired their dedication from a safe and comfortable distance. They kept their horses in the stables beneath the Temple Mount and patrolled the roads with the seriousness of men who had embraced an ideal at genuine personal cost, which is the only kind of seriousness that actually changes anything. The seal they adopted in those early years showed 2 knights riding a single horse, an image that has puzzled and fascinated interpreters across centuries with the persistence of a riddle that refuses to resolve. Some read it as a literal representation of their poverty, the brothers unable to afford separate mounts. Others see it as a symbolic statement about brotherhood, about shared purpose, about the idea that the Templar knight had surrendered his individual will so completely that even the most personal of his tools, his warhorse, the instrument of his professional identity, belonged to the community rather than to himself. Others, inevitably, have found in it something deliberately mysterious, a coded message whose meaning was known only to the initiated, which tells you more about the interpreters than about the Templars. The Templars themselves never explained it, which is entirely characteristic of an institution that understood very early in its existence the political value of controlled ambiguity. An image that everyone notices and no one can definitively explain generates attention and mystique in roughly equal measure, and attention and mystique are currencies that a small, poor, unrecognized order needed badly in its first decade of existence. What is certain is that the seal travelled everywhere the order went, stamped on documents, pressed into wax on treaties and property grants, and letters of credit becoming one of the most recognizable symbols in the medieval world, before the institution it represented was barely a generation old. The transformation from a small band of road-patrolling knights, sheltering in a borrowed stable beneath the Temple Mount, into one of the most powerful and wealthy institutions in the history of Christendom, did not happen by accident. It required a catalyst. It required someone with enough theological brilliance and enough institutional authority to take Hugh de Paynes' idea and explain to the medieval world not merely that it was useful, but that it was holy. That catalyst was coming from a monastery in Burgundy, and his name was Bernard of Clairvaux. And when he arrived in this story, he would change it permanently. Bernard of Clairvaux was the kind of man who makes historians uncomfortable, not because he is difficult to understand, but because he is impossible to dismiss. He was the abbot of the Cistercian monastery at Clairvaux in Burgundy, a community he had founded himself and shaped according to a vision of monastic life so austere, so uncompromising in its rejection of comfort and ornament and anything that might distract the mind from God, that it attracted followers by the hundreds and inspired imitators across the whole of Western Europe. He was thin, chronically ill, and possessed of a rhetorical power so formidable that contemporaries described his preaching as capable of emptying entire villages of their young men, who followed him out the door, still wearing their working clothes. Leaving behind wives and mothers and fields half ploughed, he believed in the Crusades with the absolute conviction of a man for whom the geography of the Holy Land was not foreign territory but the physical location of salvation itself. He believed in monastic reform with the ferocity of someone who understood that institutions without discipline become merely buildings with rules painted on the walls. And when Hugh de Paynes came to him in 1127 seeking the Church's formal endorsement of his new institution, Bernard recognized in the Templar idea something that fitted his own theology with a precision that must have felt, to a man of his convictions, like confirmation rather than coincidence. The problem that had troubled careful Christian thinkers about military violence for centuries, the obvious and uncomfortable tension between the commandment not to kill and the practical necessity of defending the innocent, had never been entirely resolved by the just war tradition that Augustine and his successors had developed. Augustine had provided the framework. Bernard provided the personnel department. His solution was articulated in a treatise he wrote specifically for the Templars, titled De Laude Novae Militiae, in praise of the new knighthood, and it was both theologically subtle and practically convenient in the way that the best institutional arguments always manage to be both things simultaneously. The ordinary knight. Bernard argued with the confidence of a man who had thought the problem through to its foundations, was a man who risked his soul every time he raised his sword, because his violence served human pride and human ambition rather than any divine purpose. He fought for land, for reputation, for the approval of lords and ladies, for the complex web of obligation and honour that structured feudal life. His soul was in perpetual jeopardy. The Templar knight was categorically different. He had surrendered his own will entirely through his monastic vows. He had no personal stake in the outcome of any battle he fought. He killed without anger, without pride, without the taint of individual desire. He was, in Bernard's formulation, a malicide rather than a homicide, a killer of evil rather than a killer of men. The Templar who died in battle was a martyr. The Templar who killed was a minister of God's justice, executing a sentence that divine providence had already determined. It was an elegant solution to a problem that had resisted elegance for 800 years. Whether it was a good solution is a different question entirely, one that Bernard did not particularly invite, and that the subsequent centuries would answer in ways he could not have anticipated. What mattered in 1129 was that it was a convincing solution, delivered by the most persuasive theological voice in Europe, and that conviction was the material from which the Templar institution would build everything that came after. The Council of Troyes in 1129 gave the Templars what Bernard's endorsement had made possible: formal recognition as a religious order, and a rule that would govern every aspect of their daily existence with the obsessive specificity that all functional institutions eventually discover they require. The Latin rule, later expanded into the detailed French statutes known as the retraits, specified the white mantle that distinguished full brother knights. The red cross would be added after 1147 by papal grant, and governed with equal precision when the brothers ate and what they ate, how they managed their horses, how disputes between members were to be resolved, and the exact conditions under which a brother could be expelled from the community he had sworn to serve for life. It was a document that married the spiritual rigour of Cistercian monasticism to the practical requirements of a military institution operating in the field under conditions that no monastery in Burgundy had ever been designed to address. The hierarchy it established was elaborate and carefully differentiated. Sergeants, non-noble members who served in military or administrative capacity, wore black or brown rather than the white reserved for knight brothers. Chaplains handled the liturgical and sacramental life of the order's communities, ensuring that the brothers could fulfill their religious obligations without depending on local clergy who might be unavailable, uncooperative, or simply too far away. Craftsmen, servant, and agricultural workers rounded out the institutional establishment that would eventually make each Templar commandery a self-sufficient economic organism. Bernard's endorsement and the Council of Troyes' formal recognition together opened floodgates that Hugh de Paynes could not have opened alone in a lifetime of asking. Donations poured in from across France, England, the Iberian Peninsula, and Italy. Wealthy nobles who could not themselves crusade, whether from age, obligation, infirmity, or the simple human preference for surviving, gave land, farms, mills, vineyards, and money to an order that offered in return something the medieval theological market genuinely valued: the spiritual association of holy warriors whose prayers and military service would benefit their donors' souls at a rate that ordinary monastic prayer, however sincere, could not quite match. These were not merely intercessors, they were fighters. They were killing and dying in the Holy Land in your name, and the vicarious participation that implied carried an emotional and theological charge that proved, in practice, almost irresistible to the conscience of the 12th century European nobility. Within a single generation of Troyes, The Templars had accumulated a network of properties across France, England, the Iberian Peninsula, Italy, and the Holy Land that would eventually number in the hundreds. These properties, called commanderies or preceptories depending on the region and the local linguistic tradition, were not merely dormitories where knights rested between campaigns. They were functioning economic enterprises, farms producing grain and wool, mills grinding the harvest of surrounding villages, vineyards yielding wine that fed both the brothers and the order's commercial revenues, workshops maintaining the equipment of war, and stables producing the trained war horses without which heavy cavalry simply did not exist. Each commandery was a small world unto itself, governed by a preceptor who answered to the regional master, who answered to the Grand Master in the Holy Land, who answered in theory, and increasingly in practice as well, to nobody on earth except the Pope. The Templar network was, from its earliest decades, precisely what its founders had implicitly designed, and what Bernard's theological architecture had made spiritually legitimate, a logistical system for sustaining indefinite military operations in the Holy Land from a base of European economic resources, organized with a sophistication that no secular institution of the period could match, and that most secular rulers could only observe with a mixture of admiration and the particular unease that comes from watching an institution become indispensable. The genius of the design lay in the way it fed itself. European properties funded Eastern operations. The prestige of Eastern military service motivated the donations that sustained European properties. The two ends of the system nourished each other continuously, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of wealth and reputation that grew more powerful with each passing decade, and that seemed, from the inside, almost divinely arranged because, of course, the brothers believed it was. The papal privileges that accumulated around the Templar institution across the 12th century were individually justifiable and collectively extraordinary, a combination that is, in retrospect, one of the most reliable formulas for institutional resentment that history has ever produced. Successive popes granted the Templars exemption from paying tithes on their own lands, which meant the order kept revenues that every other landowner in Christendom was required to contribute to the local church. They were exempted from the jurisdiction of local bishops, which meant that a Templar preceptory operating in the diocese of any bishop in Europe was legally invisible to that bishop's authority. He could not tax it, could not discipline it, could not compel its members to appear before his courts. The Templars were answerable only to the Pope, a relationship that gave them the institutional independence of a sovereign entity while simultaneously wrapping them in the spiritual legitimacy of the most powerful office in the medieval world. They were permitted to build their own chapels and maintain their own chaplains, meaning the entire sacramental life of the church baptism, confession, the Mass, burial could be conducted internally, without reference to or payment to the local ecclesiastical establishment. These privileges accumulated gradually, each individually defensible on the grounds of supporting the crusading effort, each adding another layer to the fortress of institutional independence that the Templars were quietly constructing around themselves, while everyone else was focused on Jerusalem. The bishops hated it with the focused intensity of men watching their own revenues and authority drain steadily away toward an institution they could neither control nor challenge. The secular clergy hated it with the weary resentment of professionals watching a competitor operate under rules that applied to no one else. Even the Hospitallers, the other great military order of the crusading period, founded even before the Templars as a hospital organization caring for sick pilgrims in Jerusalem, found the accumulated Templar exemptions deeply, specifically irritating in the way that only a rival's advantages can be irritating when you share the same fundamental purpose and compete for the same pool of donors. The Templars accepted the resentment as the straightforward price of effectiveness and continued accumulating both property and privileges with the serene confidence of an institution that had God, the Pope, and 2 centuries of compound interest on its side. What is easy to miss? Looking at the Templar network from the outside and from the distance of 7 centuries is how genuinely useful it was not merely to the order itself or to the crusading enterprise, but to the ordinary texture of economic and social life in the regions where it operated. The commanderies that dotted the English countryside, the preceptories scattered across the plains of Champagne and Normandy, and the river valleys of the Iberian Peninsula, were not alien impositions on the landscapes they inhabited. They were working parts of local economies, employing craftsmen and agricultural workers, maintaining roads and bridges and mills that the surrounding communities depended upon, providing the kind of stable institutional presence that only large landowners with multi-generational time horizons can provide. Local people rented land from the Templars, ground their grain at Templar mills, and sometimes deposited their most valuable possessions with the local preceptory when they needed secure storage, because the Templars' reputation for honest custody of other people's property extended well below the level of royal clients and crusading nobles. The order left its name across the English landscape in place names that 7 centuries of subsequent history have never quite managed to erase Temple Meads in Bristol, Temple Fortune in North London, Temple Cloud, and Temple Combe in Somerset, where a painted panel discovered in the 20th century briefly excited everyone who needed it to be a Templar devotional image, before art historians absorbed it into more measured analysis. In France, the footprint was even larger commanderies in Burgundy, Normandy, and the Languedoc, creating an institutional presence that permeated the French agricultural economy from the mid-12th century through to the catastrophic morning of October 1307. None of this was dramatic in the way that crusading battles were dramatic, but it was the material foundation without which the battles could not have been sustained, and it represented 2 centuries of careful institutional management that built something far more robust than 9 knights sheltering in a borrowed stable beneath the Temple Mount would ever have suggested was possible. The retraits, the detailed French statutes that accumulated across the 12th and 13th centuries to govern Templar life, with the obsessive specificity that all functional monastic rules eventually develop, are one of the most revealing documents that the medieval period produced about what it actually meant to live inside an institution rather than merely belong to one. They covered everything, not in the grand theological language of Bernard's treatise, not in the sweeping institutional pronouncements of the papal bulls that define the order's privileges, but in the granular, practical, occasionally startling detail of a rule book written by people who had lived with other people long enough to know exactly which behaviours needed explicit prohibition. The brother who woke before matins and could not sleep was instructed to say his prayers quietly in his bed, not disturb his companions, and the rule adding this last provision with the weary practicality of an organisation that understood very well the nature of men who had taken vows of chastity to think about nothing that would excite sinful thoughts. The brother who beat his horse excessively faced formal discipline, a prohibition that suggests either genuine institutional concern for the animals or accumulated experience with brothers who discovered that war horses were among the few outlets available to men living under vows of poverty. Chastity, and obedience in a community that did not permit them to lock their doors. That particular restriction, no locked doors, essentially never, because a locked door suggested the kind of private activity that a community under monastic vows needed to remain transparent about, appears in the statutes with the quiet emphasis of a rule that had been violated often enough to require writing down. And then there was the instruction about lions. If a lion attacked the herd you were guarding, you were to call for help. If no help came, you were to retreat in good order, because the rule, with its characteristic blend of spiritual seriousness and operational pragmatism, did not require a brother to die for livestock, only for the faith. The daily schedule was structured around the canonical hours, the 7 fixed prayer times that organised monastic life across every tradition of medieval Christendom, from the contemplative communities of the Egyptian desert through the great Benedictine abbeys of France and England, to the Templar preceptories scattered from the coast of Portugal to the fortresses of the Holy Land. The brothers prayed at matins in the small hours of the morning, before the world was fully awake and the darkness still had the quality of something sacred and slightly threatening, they prayed again at prime, at dawn, and then at terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline through the long arc of the day and into the evening. The canonical hours marking time in the way that clock towers would mark it centuries later, not merely measuring the passage of hours, but dividing experience itself into portions that belong to God, rather than to the accumulated urgencies of military and administrative life. In the field, this schedule was necessarily modified. You could not observe every canonical hour on the march or during a siege without surrendering the tactical flexibility that kept men alive in contested territory. But in the preceptories of Europe and the garrisons of the Holy Land, the liturgical rhythm structured existence as it did in every other religious house, providing the daily architecture within which the rest of life training, administration, the maintenance of horses and equipment, the management of agricultural operations took its place as something subordinate rather than primary. Meals were taken together in the refectory, in silence, while a reader read aloud from Scripture or from the rule itself. The practice was simultaneously spiritually edifying, the Word of God entering the community, even while the body was occupied with eating, and practically useful in the specific, unsentimental way that the best institutional practices managed to serve multiple purposes at once, reminding the brothers of the regulations they were obligated to follow at precisely the moment when the comfort of a meal might otherwise soften their vigilance about following them. The reception ceremony, the ritual by which new brothers were admitted to the order, deserves particular attention, because it is here that the gap between what the Templars actually did and what they would eventually be accused of doing is most precisely measurable and most historically consequential. The ceremony was conducted in private, witnessed only by existing members of the order, and this privacy was itself one of the things that made the institution suspicious in the eyes of outsiders, who measured transparency against concealment and concluded, in the absence of information, that the concealment must be hiding something proportionate to its care. What the rule specified actually happened was a liturgical and procedural affair combining monastic profession with military induction, practical, serious, and entirely orthodox in its structure. The candidate was asked the required questions about his personal status. Was he free from prior religious vows? Was he free from debts that would compromise the order? Was he married? Or promised in marriage? Was he in good health? Without hidden illness that would prevent the military service he was committing to, he was warned. With an emphasis the rule specified as genuine rather than rhetorical, about the severity of the life he was choosing: hard beds, poor food, rough cloth, and death as a professional occupational hazard rather than a remote theoretical possibility. He was invested with the white mantle. He was welcomed into the brotherhood with a kiss. The ceremony was then closed, with the rule specifying that nothing discussed within it was to be repeated outside the community. It was this single provision, confidentiality, about a ceremony that outsiders could not attend, that would be handed to Philip IV's inquisitors 2 centuries later and inflated, through the mechanisms of torture and institutional terror, into allegations of obscene kisses and ritual denial of Christ. The distance between those two things, a reasonable requirement for discretion in a religious community, and the charges that burned men alive on an island in the Seine, is the precise measure of what political necessity, applied with sufficient ruthlessness to the machinery of medieval justice, was capable of manufacturing. The castles the Templars built across the Crusade estates were among the finest military architecture. The medieval world produced structures so carefully engineered, so precisely calibrated to the defensive problems of their specific landscapes, that military historians studying them 8 centuries later still find details worth admiring. Château Pèlerin, known also as Atlit, constructed on a promontory on the Palestinian coast after 1218, represents the order's architectural thinking at its most sophisticated and most confident. Massive concentric walls created overlapping defensive zones so that an attacker who breached the outer ring found himself standing in a killing ground between 2 walls rather than inside a conquered fortress. Towers projected far enough from the walls to allow flanking fire along the entire face of each defensive line, eliminating the dead ground that besiegers exploited when towers were flush with the walls they were supposed to protect. A water-filled moat on the landward side multiplied the difficulty of any assault from the direction most accessible to a land army. The position on the sea meant the garrison could be supplied by ship, even during a complete landward siege, a logistical advantage that transformed the calculus of any commander contemplating a prolonged operation against it. Château Pèlerin was never taken by assault. When the Templars evacuated it in 1291 following the fall of Acre, they did so voluntarily, the last piece of Latin territory on the Palestinian mainland, abandoned in good order rather than lost in battle. The castle still stands in partial ruin on the Israeli coast near the modern city of Atlit, its enormous stones as permanent and as indifferent to the centuries as the day they were set in place. Stone remembers nothing, which is perhaps why it outlasts everything that does. The Templar fighting rule, the sections of the retraits governing military conduct specified with considerable precision exactly how knights were to behave in combat, and the specificity itself reveals something important about the order's understanding of what made professional soldiers professionally useful. Brothers were not to break formation without explicit command from the marshal. They were not to charge or retreat without orders, regardless of what the surrounding battle was doing, regardless of what individual judgment or personal courage might suggest. If the Bauséant, the black and white battle standard that served as the order's military identity made visible and portable, was still flying, every Templar on the field was obligated to rally to it regardless of personal danger, regardless of the distance, regardless of the apparent hopelessness of the situation around it. If the Bauséant fell, they were to rally to the nearest Crusader, standard still standing. Only if every Crusader banner on the entire field had fallen were individual Templars permitted to exercise personal judgment about withdrawal. The effect of these rules was to create a unit that anchored the formation of any army it fought alongside, refusing to break even under conditions that would have caused ordinary feudal cavalry to scatter into the landscape and spend the following weeks making their way home individually. The effect was also, and this is the part that the rules authors understood and accepted, to create a unit that suffered catastrophic losses when a battle turned decisively against it, because the retraits made organised withdrawal extremely difficult in practice. At the Battle of La Forbie in 1244, the Templars lost approximately 300 knights in a single engagement, a number representing a significant fraction of the order's total military strength at any given moment. They refilled the ranks and continued, because that was what the institution did, and because the alternative to continuing was acknowledging that the entire project was impossible, which was not a conclusion the Templar rule permitted. What is consistently underrepresented in popular accounts of the Templars, accounts that prefer the drama of battlefield charges to the slower, stranger drama of cross-cultural negotiation, is the sophistication and the genuine complexity of the Order's relationships with the Islamic world. They had come to the Holy Land to fight 2 centuries of coexistence, warfare, negotiation, and commercial interaction in the Levant produced a Byzantine web of relationships that defied the clean categories of crusading ideology at almost every point. Templar commanders negotiated truces with Muslim rulers when the military situation made fighting strategically unwise, exercising a pragmatic flexibility that horrified crusading idealists visiting from Europe, and that the permanent residents of Outremer understood as the basic requirement for institutional survival in a region where their political position was always precarious and never self-sustaining. Individual Templars learned Arabic not as an intellectual exercise but as an operational necessity for anyone managing relationships on the frontier, gathering the intelligence that kept garrisons alive in contested territory, and conducting the commercial transactions that sustained the Order's Levantine properties, the assassins, the Nizari Ismaili branch of Shia Islam, whose mountain strongholds in Syria made them a significant and entirely independent power in the Levant, had a particularly intricate relationship with the Templars that included tribute payments, diplomatic exchanges, and at least one celebrated and deeply ambiguous incident recorded in the Chronicle of William of Tyre. An assassin envoy arrived at the court of the King of Jerusalem bearing what appeared to be a genuine proposal of conversion to Christianity, an offer that was interrupted when a Templar knight murdered the envoy on the road. Apparently calculating that conversion would prove diplomatically inconvenient for the tribute arrangements that currently benefited the order. Whether the story is accurate in its details is genuinely uncertain. That it was believed, and believed to be entirely characteristic of Templar institutional behaviour, when institutional interests conflicted with broader Crusader objectives, is itself a historical fact of considerable significance, revealing how the order was perceived by the people who watched it operate most closely, and how that perception would eventually be weaponized by people who needed a convincing villain and found the Templars already half-cast for the role. The summer of 1187 arrived in the Holy Land, with the particular quality of heat that the region produces in July dry. Absolute. The kind of heat that makes the air itself feel hostile to human occupation. Saladin had spent years doing what no Muslim ruler since the First Crusade had managed to accomplish, uniting Egypt and Syria under a single command. Eliminating the political fragmentation that the Crusader states had exploited with considerable skill throughout the 12th century, and building a military force large enough and disciplined enough to confront the Frankish heavy cavalry on terms he chose rather than terms they imposed. The trap he set in the summer of that year was a masterpiece of strategic patience. He laid siege to Tiberias, a city whose countess was the wife of Raymond III of Tripoli, one of the most experienced and clear-eyed political minds in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and waited. He knew that the siege would force a response. He knew the terrain between the Crusader forces and Tiberias. He knew the location of the water, and he waited with the confidence of a commander who had already won the battle in his mind and needed only the enemy's cooperation to win it on the ground. Raymond himself, who understood what Saladin was doing, with a clarity born of long experience and genuine strategic intelligence, counselled against marching. He argued correctly, as events would demonstrate with the pitiless precision of a military lesson written in several thousand lives, that Tiberius could be sacrificed, that his own wife could be sacrificed, that no city was worth the destruction of the kingdom's entire field army on ground that Saladin had selected and prepared. His counsel was rejected. Guy of Lusignan, the king of Jerusalem, weak in the particular way that rulers are weak when their claim to authority is contested and their need for approval from powerful subordinates overrides their judgment, chose to march. The Templar Grandmaster Gerard de Riedefort, a man whose personal history included a pattern of poor military decisions elevated by institutional position into catastrophic ones, reportedly encouraged the march with the enthusiasm of someone who had confused courage with wisdom and found the confusion flattering to his self-image. The army that marched toward Tiberias on the 3rd of July 1187 was, on paper, the most formidable military force the Crusader states had assembled in a generation. In practice, it was walking into a carefully prepared killing ground with the methodical determination of men who had been told that God was watching and that retreat was therefore unthinkable. Saladin's light cavalry harassed the column continuously, picking off stragglers, preventing foraging, making every hour of march more costly than the last. The critical decision came at the springs of Safuria, the last reliable water source before Tiberias, a landscape detail that Saladin had factored into his planning with the precision of a general who understood that thirst kills armies more reliably than swords. The Crusader force camped at Safuria and debated through the evening. Gerard de Riedefort argued for continuing the march. Raymond argued for stopping, for making Saladin come to them on ground with water available. Guy chose to continue. The army moved away from the springs the following morning and into the waterless hills above the Sea of Galilee that shimmered below them, with the particular cruelty of water that cannot be reached. Saladin surrounded the column before it could establish a defensive position. That night his forces burned the dry scrub around the Crusader camp, adding smoke to thirst, filling the air with the smell of burning and the sound of Muslim soldiers performing the night prayers that drifted across the darkness to the exhausted, dehydrating men inside the perimeter. By the morning of July the 4th, the Crusader army was trapped on the twin peaks known as the Horns of Hattin, the name from an Arabic word describing the shape of the ridge, fighting under conditions of thirst and exhaustion that had already decided the outcome before. The first charge was made. The infantry broke first, climbing the hill and refusing to descend when the mounted knights tried to rally them. Their capacity for obedience burned away by heat and hopelessness. The cavalry charged repeatedly into the encircling Muslim forces and could not break through. The red tent that Saladin had pitched on the high ground to observe the battle remained standing through charge after charge, his centre unbroken. His confidence visible to everyone on both sides who could see it. In the early afternoon, a final desperate Templar charge came close enough to Saladin's position that he caught his son by the shoulder when the boy began to panic. Then it was over. The prisoners taken at Hattin included King Guy. The true cross carried into battle as the kingdom's most sacred relic and its most potent spiritual weapon, and a large number of Templar and Hospitaller knights, whose fate Saladin handled with a deliberateness that clarified his understanding of who his real opponents were. Ordinary noble prisoners received the consideration that the evolved code of warfare between Muslim and Christian rulers had developed over decades of interaction ransom, negotiation, the pragmatic recognition that captured aristocrats were worth more alive than dead. The Templars and Hospitallers he had executed, offering each man the choice of conversion to Islam before the sentence was carried out, a choice that none of them accepted. His reasoning was stated clearly, and it was strategically impeccable. Ordinary knights could be ransomed and would return to their farms and their families. Templar and Hospitaller knights would be ransomed and would return directly to the battlefield. They were, in his precise assessment, professional holy warriors of irreversible commitment, men whose institutional vows made them permanently dangerous, regardless of what personal promises they offered. He was correct. He killed them accordingly. Jerusalem fell in October 1187, 3 months after Hattin, and Saladin's entry into the city was conducted with a restraint that contrasted with the massacre of 1099, so pointedly that Christian chroniclers struggle to explain it without acknowledging the comparison. The Muslim population was protected. Christian civilians were given 40 days to raise their ransoms. The Templar headquarters in the Al-Aqsa Mosque was reconsecrated for Islamic worship. The Kingdom of Jerusalem had effectively ceased to exist, and with it, the entire justification for the institution that had defined itself by its defence. The Third Crusade, which brought Richard I of England to the shores of the Levant in 1191, was probably the most competent military operation. The crusading movement ever produced a campaign distinguished by logistical sophistication, tactical discipline, and a commander who understood the specific challenges of fighting in the Levantine environment well enough to adapt his methods to its demands, rather than imposing European assumptions on a landscape that punished European assumptions. With particular efficiency, Richard's coastal advance from Acre to Jaffa became one of the most studied military movements of the medieval period, and the Templars served as its backbone in the most literal sense, positioned at the front of the column, absorbing the continuous harassment of Saladin's cavalry with a discipline that the fighting rule had spent decades producing, and that now demonstrated its value under conditions precise enough to serve as a textbook illustration. The orders were absolute and absolutely maintained. No Templar was to break formation in response to the harassment, no matter how close the arrows fell, no matter how provocative the feints of the Muslim light cavalry became. The column moved like a single armoured organism along the coast, the sea on one flank providing both protection and the logistical lifeline of the fleet that kept the army supplied, without requiring it to forage in territory Saladin controlled. At Arsuf, where the decisive engagement of the campaign unfolded, it was actually the Hospitallers at the rear of the column who eventually broke formation under unbearable provocation, charging before Richard's order was given. Their discipline finally exhausted by the cumulative pressure of weeks of controlled restraint. Richard, furious at the breach but too experienced to waste the momentum it created, adapted in real time and turned the unauthorized charge into a victory by throwing his full cavalry behind it. Saladin withdrew. The coast to Jaffa was open. Jerusalem, which Richard approached twice and withdrew from twice, judging each time that the political situation made holding the city impossible, even if taking it proved achievable, remained Muslim. A treaty gave Christian pilgrims access to the holy sites. The coastal cities survived. The Templars continued. Because continuing was what they did. The 13th century was the period of the Templars' greatest institutional power and their most revealing contradictions. Contradictions that illuminate not merely the order itself, but the fundamental tensions built into any institution that grows powerful enough to pursue its own interests, while nominally serving a purpose larger than itself. They were simultaneously the most professionally disciplined military force in the Crusader states, and the organization most likely to undermine a campaign by placing institutional calculations above strategic coherence. They were the most financially sophisticated institution in Western Christendom, and the one most consistently accused of allowing financial sophistication to drift into financial self-interest. The Fifth Crusade of 1218 to 1221 provided one of the clearest illustrations of how these tensions played out in practice. The campaign captured the strategically vital Egyptian city of Damietta at the mouth of the Nile in 1219 after a siege of extraordinary difficulty. Then sat inside it for 18 months, while the Crusade leadership argued about whether to accept an extraordinary peace offer from the Egyptian Sultan, an offer that included the return of Jerusalem itself in exchange for the Crusaders evacuating Egypt. The papal legate Pelagius refused, partly on theological grounds and partly because he expected a German crusade that would tip the military balance sufficiently to make conquest preferable to negotiation. The German crusade did not arrive in time. The Crusaders marched on Cairo, found the Nile floods cutting off their line of advance with the methodical indifference of geography, and were forced into a capitulation that surrendered Damietta and gained nothing whatsoever. It was one of the most avoidable military disasters in crusading history, and the Templars participated throughout, serving in the fighting with their characteristic professionalism, while bearing no particular responsibility for the strategic decisions that converted a promising position into a humiliating retreat. The Order's opposition to Frederick II during his crusade of 1228 to 1229 illustrates a different and more troubling kind of institutional judgment. Frederick was the Holy Roman Emperor, a ruler of genuine brilliance and equally genuine political toxicity, who arrived in the Holy Land under papal excommunication, the product of a years-long quarrel with Rome that made his crusade technically spiritually invalid from the start. Perspective of the ecclesiastical establishment. He had spent years in diplomatic contact with the Egyptian Sultan al-Kamil, and he negotiated a treaty that returned Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Nazareth, and a corridor to the coast to Christian control for 10 years. By any rational strategic assessment, it was a remarkable achievement. The Holy City recovered without a battle, without a siege, without the catastrophic losses that military operations in the Levant routinely produced. The Templars refused to cooperate with his campaign, maintaining a studied institutional distance that made their hostility legible to everyone watching. Their objections were not entirely without foundation. The treaty left the Temple Mount in Muslim hands, left Jerusalem's defences incomplete, and rested on the diplomatic goodwill of a relationship that the next Sultan was under no obligation to honour. Jerusalem was lost again in 1244, permanently this time, without ever having been adequately fortified. Louis IX of France, the king later canonised as Saint Louis, led 2 crusades and embodied the crusading ideal more completely than any other 13th century ruler, genuinely pious, organisationally capable, personally brave, and willing to spend enormous royal resources on a project he understood as a religious obligation rather than a political calculation. The Templars supported his campaigns fully and fought in them with the Order's characteristic professionalism. They failed anyway, because Egypt proved too large, too well defended, and too competently governed to be conquered by any force the crusading movement could assemble and sustain. Louis was captured at the Battle of Fariska in 1250, ransomed at enormous cost, and spent years afterwards supervising the fortification of the coastal cities before returning to France. He tried again in 1270, died of disease outside Tunis before the campaign properly began, and was buried where he fell. The crusading conviction he embodied, the belief that sufficient piety combined with sufficient military organization could recover what had been lost, died with him, not completely, but with a quality of genuine faith that subsequent crusades never quite recovered. The problem of money in the medieval world was not merely a problem of quantity, though quantity was always a concern, for institutions and individuals operating at the edge of their financial means, but a problem of physics. Gold and silver were heavy. A chest of silver pennies sufficient to pay a medium-sized army for a month required a small wagon just for the coin, and an armed escort large enough to make the transport conspicuous and therefore dangerous. The roads between Western Europe and the Holy Land were long, passed through multiple jurisdictions with varying degrees of law enforcement, and were populated by bandits whose professional interest in other people's money was sharpened considerably by the knowledge that crusaders and pilgrims were likely to be carrying more of it than ordinary travellers. A pilgrim or crusader who converted his entire accumulated wealth into coin before leaving home faced a journey of months or years during which that coin could be lost to thieves, shipwreck, dishonest merchants, corrupt officials, or the simple bad luck that medieval travel distributed with democratic impartiality across every social rank. The wealthy could absorb such losses. Sometimes the less wealthy could not, and the crusading enterprise, which depended on a continuous flow of human and material resources from Europe to the Levant, was perpetually threatened by the gap between the wealth that existed in principle in the form of property, livestock, and agricultural production across the estates of Europe and the portable, transferable form of that wealth that military operations in the Eastern Mediterranean actually required. The Templars, who maintained preceptories across Europe and a major institutional establishment in the Holy Land, found themselves positioned at both ends of this problem simultaneously and recognized, with the practical intelligence of an organization that had been managing logistics across long distances for decades, that their position gave them the means to solve it. The mechanism they developed worked with an elegance that the complexity of the problem it solved tends to obscure when described abstractly. A pilgrim or crusader arriving at a Templar preceptory in France could deposit a sum of money and receive in exchange a document, a letter of credit, that could be presented at a Templar house in the Holy Land and redeemed for the equivalent value, minus a service fee whose precise nature varied by transaction and whose technical description was carefully managed to avoid the language of interest that the Church's prohibition on usury made legally and theologically dangerous. The money itself never needed to travel. What travelled was the document, and documents were dramatically easier to carry, to hide, and to protect than bags of coin. A letter of credit folded into a pilgrim's clothing took up no meaningful space, weighed nothing detectable, and could be rendered worthless to a thief who lacked the institutional relationship with the Templar network required to redeem it. The security advantage alone would have made the system attractive. Combined with the elimination of transport risk and the convenience of not arriving in Jerusalem carrying everything you owned in a form that announced its own value to anyone watching, the letter of credit represented a solution so practically superior to the alternatives that its adoption was less a choice than an inevitability for anyone who understood what the Templars were offering. The Templars were not, it should be noted honestly, the inventors of the underlying concept. Islamic merchants had been using similar instruments, the suffraga, in their commercial networks for centuries before the First Crusade, and the Templars almost certainly developed their system partly in awareness of and partly in deliberate adaptation of instruments they encountered in the Levantine trade world they inhabited alongside Muslim and Jewish merchants. What they contributed was not the idea, but the institutional infrastructure, the network of preceptories, the standardized procedures, the reputation for reliability that made the documents trustworthy, that made the idea work at continental scale. The Paris Temple, the great fortified compound on the northern edge of the French capital, Its tower, visible from a considerable distance and known throughout the city simply as the place where serious money was kept safely, had by the mid-13th century become something that the 12th century could not quite have. Imagine the effective treasury of the French monarchy. The taxes collected by royal agents across France were deposited there before being allocated to royal expenditures. The Templar treasurer effectively managed the daily cash operations of the French state, dispersing money to royal officials and recording receipts and payments in accounts that were audited regularly and maintained with the institutional discipline of an organization whose entire reputation rested on the accuracy of its records. King Louis IX used the Templar treasurer in Paris as his de facto finance minister, a relationship of institutional dependence between the French crown and the Templar order that both parties understood as mutually beneficial and that neither party could have anticipated would eventually contribute to catastrophe. The London Temple served a parallel function for the English crown, its round church still standing near the Thames today as one of the finest examples of Norman ecclesiastical architecture in England. The Master of the Temple in England sat in Parliament among the ecclesiastical lords. Royal treasure was stored at the Temple. When Richard I was ransomed from his Austrian captivity in 1192, 150,000 marks of silver, the largest ransom in English medieval history, the Templars and Hospitallers played a central role in managing the collection and transfer of funds across the international network required to assemble and deliver a sum of that magnitude. The operation demonstrated with complete visibility that exactly one institution in the Western world possessed the network, the credit, and the operational capacity to move that kind of money safely across European distances. The financial logic the Templars pioneered, transferring value as information rather than as physical metal, managing other people's money as an organized institutional service rather than as a series of individual favors passed through the Italian banking houses of the 13th and 14th centuries, the Bardi and Peruzzi, and later the Medici, into the first national banks of the 17th century and onward into the architecture of modern finance. The Templars did not invent banking. They demonstrated, on a scale and with an institutional sophistication that had no contemporary parallel, that it was possible to manage money across international distances as a system. That demonstration was influential in ways that are still working themselves out. The city of Acre in the spring of 1291 was the last major city of the Crusader states, the commercial and administrative capital of what remained of Outrima after 2 centuries of attrition, political fragmentation, and the slow, grinding pressure of Muslim reconquest that had reclaimed the interior of the Holy Land piece by piece, while the coastal cities held on with the stubborn determination of communities that had nowhere else to go. It was a dense and prosperous place, its harbour busy with the merchant vessels of the Italian communes, whose commercial interests in the eastern Mediterranean had outlasted every political arrangement that had attempted to govern them. Its streets populated by the layered communities of a port city that had absorbed 2 centuries of Crusader migration, local Christian population, and the complex human residue of wars that leave survivors as well as casualties, the various factions of Outremer, the military orders, the Italian communes, the local baronage, the remnant representatives of the Crusader aristocracy had spent the previous decades feuding with one another inside Acre's walls, with the same creative intensity they had brought to every political question in the region, quarrelling over precedence and jurisdiction and commercial privilege, with a focus that occasionally seemed to have entirely displaced awareness of the existential military pressure building outside the city's formidable defences. When the Mamluk Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil arrived before the walls in April of 1291, with an army whose size the chronicles describe in numbers that may be exaggerated, but whose general scale was clearly overwhelming, the city's defenders, including substantial Templar and Hospitaller forces, the remnants of the Crusader baronage, and contingents from Cyprus and from Western Europe, who had arrived too late and in too small numbers to change the arithmetic, organised themselves for a defence that everyone present understood was likely to be the last act of the entire crusading enterprise in the Holy Land. The walls held for weeks. The defence was conducted with genuine determination and considerable professional skill. the kind of fighting that military orders produced when institutional discipline was applied to desperate circumstances rather than the more ambiguous, strategic situations that had generated so much controversy during the preceding century. The Templar Grandmaster, William the Beaujeu, who had spent his entire tenure attempting to build the diplomatic relationships that might have preserved what military force alone could not protect, was killed during the fighting, struck through a gap in his armour by a projectile whose exact nature the sources describe differently, but whose effect was the same, regardless of the specifics. As he fell, some of those around him reportedly believed he was retreating from the wall, pulling back from the fighting, he told them, with what the chronicle describes as the particular calm of a man who has already passed the point where his own survival is a relevant consideration, that he was not retreating because he was dead. It is the kind of line that history occasionally produces precise, understated, and so entirely characteristic of everything the institution had tried to be for 170 years, that it reads less like an individual statement and more like the order's epitaph delivered by the man most qualified to speak it. The breakthrough came when a section of the outer wall near the accursed tower gave way under the sustained assault of Mamluk siege engines, and the fighting moved from the organized structure of defended walls into the chaotic intimacy of street combat, where the numerical advantage of the attackers became decisive in the way that numbers always become decisive when the geometry of defense collapses into the geometry of open ground. The last stand of the Templars in Acre took place in their fortress, the Order's compound at the southwestern corner of the city. Positioned on the sea in the way that Templar military architecture consistently sought positions that combined defensive strength on the landward side with maritime access for supply and evacuation, a group of survivors, including civilians who had taken refuge in the compound when the rest of the city fell, held the fortress for 10 days after Acre itself was gone, 10 days during which everything that the Crusader states had been was reduced to a single fortified compound on a Mediterranean promontory, defended by men who understood with complete clarity that there was no relief coming and no outcome available except the one they were delaying. A Mamluk commander eventually negotiated a surrender agreement with the small Templar garrison. When his soldiers entered the compound and began assaulting the women and boys sheltering inside, the Templars killed them. The negotiations collapsed with the finality of an agreement violated beyond any possibility of reconstruction. The Mamluks undermined the foundations of the tower housing the Templar garrison. It collapsed, killing everyone inside Templar knights, Mamluk soldiers, and civilians together. The rubble, making no distinctions that the living had considered important. The Templars evacuated what records and relics they could by sea. The city was systematically demolished to prevent any future Crusader force from using it as a beachhead. The Latin presence in mainland Palestine, which had begun with the breach of Jerusalem's walls in 1099, ended with the collapse of a tower in Acre in 1291, not with a treaty or a negotiated withdrawal, but with falling stone and the sound of the sea continuing regardless. The question that now faced the surviving Templar leadership, regrouped on Cyprus with their institutional structure intact and their institutional purpose suddenly and completely dissolved, was both practical and existential in a way that institutional questions rarely manage to be simultaneously. The Order's entire identity, its vows, its privileges, its justification for existing outside the normal structures of ecclesiastical and secular authority, its claim on the donations of European nobility, its argument for the papal exemptions that had generated 2 centuries of episcopal resentment had been organized around the defense of the Holy Land. The Holy Land was gone. The strategic discussions that followed in Cyprus about reconquest, about reorganization, about whether to merge the military orders into a single unified institution, were genuine and sophisticated debates conducted by serious men who understood the problem. But they were also debates conducted by an institution that had lost the thing that made it make sense, and that had perhaps a decade to find a new answer before the question was answered for it by someone who had been watching the Templar network's European properties and financial operations with the focused attention of a man who had already decided what he intended to do. Philip IV of France, known to history as Philip the Fair, an epithet referring to his physical appearance rather than to any quality of character that his actions particularly demonstrated, was the most ruthlessly calculating monarch of his generation. And his generation was not short of ruthless calculators. He had inherited a France that was already the most powerful kingdom in Western Europe, and spent his reign extending royal authority at the expense of every competing institution with the systematic patience of a man who understood that power is not seized in single dramatic moments but accumulated through the steady erosion of every limit placed upon it. His quarrel with Pope Boniface VIII, which escalated from a dispute about the crown's right to tax the French clergy into a confrontation so direct and so personal that Philip's agents arrested the Pope in his own palace at Anagni in 1303, demonstrated both his willingness to act against the theoretical authority of the Church and his practical power to do so without suffering consequences proportionate to the transgression. Boniface died within a month of the arrest, broken by the humiliation of it in a way that physical violence alone could not quite have accomplished. The papacy elected a French pope, Clement V, who moved the papal court to Avignon in southern France in 1309 and operated for the following decades in a state of political dependency on the French crown that later historians would describe as the Babylonian captivity of the papacy, a phrase chosen deliberately to evoke the image of an institution held captive far from its proper home by a power it could not resist. Philip had not merely defeated the papacy in a political argument, he had restructured the relationship between the French crown and the most powerful spiritual authority in Christendom so thoroughly that the institution which should have been the Templars' ultimate protector was now, in any practical sense, his instrument. His financial situation was, by the standards of his military ambitions, perpetually and urgently inadequate, a condition that shaped every major decision of his reign, with the consistency of a chronic illness that never quite resolves. He had expelled the Jews from France in 1306, confiscating their assets and their outstanding loan contracts in a brutal act of fiscal predation dressed carefully in the theological language of religious purification. As if the packaging could change the contents, he had debased the currency repeatedly enough to earn from those who suffered the consequences the nickname the Counterfeiter King, a designation that combined accurate description with genuine popular fury at the way monetary manipulation transferred wealth from everyone who held coin to the crown that controlled the mint. He owed substantial debts to the Templars and to the Italian banking houses that had financed his wars. Debts whose existence created a particular kind of resentment that debtors have felt toward their creditors since the invention of lending, the resentment of a man who needs what another man has and cannot quite forgive the other man for having it. When Philip looked at the Templar order with the assessing attention of a ruler who had learned to see every institution primarily as either a resource or an obstacle, he saw an organization of extraordinary wealth, whose properties across France represented a concentration of land and revenue that exceeded that of many secular nobles, whose treasury in the Paris Temple held reserves accumulated over 2 centuries of donation and financial service, and whose institutional independence exempt from royal taxation, exempt from royal justice, answerable only to a pope who was now effectively answerable to him, placed those resources just beyond the reach of the mechanisms he had used to extract wealth from every other source available to him. The combination was intolerable in the specific way that only a thing you need but cannot have is intolerable to a man accustomed to having everything he decides that jag needs. The pretext Philip required was extraordinary, because the action he contemplated was extraordinary, the arrest of an entire religious order whose members had taken vows recognized by the Church, whose properties were technically the possessions of the papacy rather than of any secular power, and whose military reputation, however diminished by the fall of Acre, still carried enough residual prestige to make naked confiscation politically dangerous without a cover of legitimate process. The charges that emerged, whether fabricated entirely by Philip's ministers, assembled from the testimony of disgruntled former members, or built on some kernel of genuine internal Templar practice that was then systematically distorted into something unrecognizable, were specific, shocking, and precisely calibrated to the medieval imagination's deepest anxieties about secret societies operating outside the visible structures of Christian society. New initiates, it was alleged, were required during their reception ceremony to deny Christ 3 times and spit upon the cross. The brothers allegedly worshipped an idol called Baphomet, a word that has never been satisfactorily explained, and that appears nowhere in any other contemporary source, its very opacity serving the accusation's purposes better than any clear definition could have. The brothers allegedly permitted and encouraged sodomy among themselves. Their chaplains allegedly omitted the words of consecration from the Mass, rendering the Eucharist invalid and the brothers' entire sacramental life a performance of empty ritual. Senior officers allegedly absolved brothers of sins, claiming a power that belonged exclusively to ordained priests. Taken together, the accusations amounted to the claim that the most celebrated Christian military order in Europe was secretly a community of heretics and perverts, whose outward piety concealed systematic apostasy practiced behind the closed doors of reception ceremonies that nobody outside the order was permitted to witness. On the morning of Friday, the 13th of October, 1307, before the sun had fully risen over Paris, sealed orders that had been distributed across France in the preceding days were opened simultaneously by royal officials in dozens of locations, and the arrests began. The coordination required to arrest nearly every Templar in France simultaneously, before dawn on a single morning, was itself a remarkable administrative achievement, a demonstration that Philip IV's government had developed the organizational capacity to execute complex covert operations across a large territory with a speed and secrecy that the medieval period rarely managed at national scale. The sealed orders had been prepared and distributed days or weeks in advance, held by royal officials who had been instructed to act at the designated moment without prior disclosure to anyone who might warn the Templars that the net was closing. The operation succeeded with a completeness that suggests either extraordinary operational security on the Crown's part or the absence of any genuine conspiracy among the Templars that might have generated the kind of internal communications that conspiracies always eventually produce. Jacques de Molay, the Templar Grand Master, had come to France for the planned funeral of Philip's sister-in-law, Catherine of Valois, and had been staying as an honoured guest of the king in the Paris temple, sleeping in the institution's own compound, surrounded by its own walls, in a state of trust so complete that it constituted, in retrospect, a failure of institutional vigilance so profound it reads almost like innocence. He was arrested in that compound on the morning of October the 13th, 1307, as were virtually all of the senior officers of the order in France, without resistance, without forewarning, without any of the organised response that an institution genuinely harbouring the secrets Philip's accusations described would presumably have prepared against exactly this kind of threat. The arrest of an entire religious order in a single morning was unprecedented in the history of medieval Europe. Nobody had attempted it before because nobody had previously combined the political will, the administrative capacity, and the institutional opportunity that Philip possessed in 1307. The interrogation process that followed the arrests was conducted by royal and inquisitorial officials working in close coordination, a collaboration that blurred the boundary between ecclesiastical justice, which theoretically governed matters of heresy, and royal justice, which theoretically had no jurisdiction over members of a religious order answerable only to the Pope. The inquisitorial toolkit had been developed over the preceding century primarily for use against the Cathar heretics of southern France, refined through decades of application into a system of considerable sophistication whose effectiveness rested not primarily on the application of physical pain, but on the management of psychological states that physical pain was used to produce and sustain. The first stage was confrontation. The prisoner presented with the charges, shown the list of brothers who had already confessed, offered the prospect of mercy for those who cooperated fully and promptly. The second stage was the formal threat of torture, which canonical law required to be presented explicitly and specifically before being applied. a procedural requirement that served the dual purpose of giving the prisoner a final opportunity to confess voluntarily, and of creating a documentary record that the confession that followed had been preceded by a proper warning rather than simply extracted by surprise. The third stage, for those who did not confess under the first two, was the strappado suspension by the wrists bound behind the back, a technique that created acute and escalating pain through the progressive stress on the shoulder joints, and that left no immediately visible marks of the kind that might complicate subsequent legal proceedings. Confessions extracted under these conditions were then read back to the prisoners and attested under seal, creating documents that had the formal appearance of voluntary testimony and the actual character of statements made by men in severe pain who had been told that cooperation was their only path to any outcome short of death. The confessions were numerous, and their numerousness was itself a central element of Philip's strategy, the sheer volume of admissions, creating a social and political reality that was difficult to challenge even for observers who understood very well how the admissions had been obtained. Jacques de Molay confessed. Other senior officers confessed. Ordinary brothers confessed in numbers that the inquisitorial records document with the careful precision of administrators who understood that the quantity of confessions was as important as their content. What makes the Templar trial confessions particularly resistant to simple analysis is that a significant proportion of the brothers who confessed under torture or the threat of torture subsequently maintained those confessions in formal proceedings before ecclesiastical commissions operating under conditions that did not involve immediate physical duress, a pattern that those who argue the charges were entirely fabricated have genuine difficulty explaining, and that those who argue the charges contain some kernel of truth cite as their strongest evidence. Modern psychological research on false confessions, a field the medieval period obviously lacked, but that has developed considerable sophistication in the modern one, suggests that people who make false confessions under severe duress frequently maintain them after the immediate pressure is removed, partly from the disorientation that extended imprisonment produces in the mind, and partly from a psychological investment in the false account that makes retraction feel more dangerous than continuation. The geographic pattern of the confessions maps this dynamic with cartographic precision in France, where the arrests were complete and the inquisitorial process was applied with full royal backing. Confessions were numerous and severe. In Cyprus, where the Eastern Templars had gathered, the proceedings produced minimal confessions. In the British Isles, where the process was conducted with less rigour, the commissions found essentially nothing of substance. In Aragon and Portugal, the local ecclesiastical authorities arrived at conclusions sufficiently favourable to the order that successor institutions absorbed the former Templars with minimal disruption. The pattern of confession followed the pattern of French royal power with a fidelity that tells you everything you need to know about what was actually being measured. The Council of Vienne in 1311 and 1312 was supposed to resolve the question through formal judicial process. It did not. The order was suppressed under the papal bull vox in excelso in March 1312, not with a verdict of guilty on the charges, but with an administrative dissolution on the grounds that the order's reputation had been so damaged by the proceedings that it could no longer function effectively. It was the judicial equivalent of destroying a man's home because someone had accused him of keeping it untidily, and then noting that he no longer appeared to have adequate housing. Jacques de Molay had been a Templar for 50 years when the arrests came. He had joined the order as a young man in approximately 1265, received into the Brotherhood at Beaune in Burgundy, with the ceremony whose privacy would later be twisted into evidence of its own corruption, and spent the following decades moving through the institutional hierarchy of an organization that was still, when he joined it, the most celebrated Christian military order in the world. He had served in the Holy Land during the final desperate years of the Crusader states, fought at the sieges that preceded the fall of Acre, watched the institution he had given his life to evacuate the last piece of Latin Palestine and regroup on Cyprus with its structure intact and its purpose suddenly and completely dissolved. He had been elected Grand Master in 1298, inheriting a position of nominal authority over an institution whose actual power was contracting with the relentless logic of an enterprise that had lost its primary theatre of operations and had not yet found a convincing replacement. He had spent his grandmastership navigating the strategic debates about reconquest and reorganization, the proposals to merge the military orders into a single unified institution, the discussions about refocusing crusading energy on the Iberian Peninsula rather than the distant and expensive enterprise of recovering Palestine debates. He engaged with the seriousness of a man who understood their importance and the frustration of a man who understood that serious debates, conducted by serious people, do not always produce the decisions that seriousness recommends. He had been in France at Philip's invitation, staying as an honoured guest in the Paris Temple. When the arrests came before dawn on Friday, the 13th of October, 1307, he had confessed. Then he had retracted. Then he had confessed again. Then he had retracted again, a cycle that traced across nearly 7 years of imprisonment, the psychological journey of a man of 70, navigating between institutional loyalty, personal survival, and the particular kind of exhaustion that extended captivity produces in people who had organized their entire lives around physical action and institutional certainty. The commission that convened in March 1314 to deliver the final sentence had been told what sentence to deliver. Philip's advisers had arranged the outcome with the same careful management they had applied to every stage of the proceedings: life imprisonment for the senior officers, a resolution that would remove them permanently from any capacity to challenge the trial's conclusions, while avoiding the complications that execution of a grandmaster might generate. The commission assembled in public, before a crowd that the chronicles describe as substantial, and read out the sentence with the formal solemnity that judicial proceedings derive from the pretense that their outcomes are discovered rather than predetermined. Jacques de Molay listened. Geoffrey de Charny, the preceptor of Normandy who had also been held since the arrests, and who would die alongside his grandmaster before the day was finished, listened beside him. Then something shifted in the old man that 7 years of imprisonment had not managed to extinguish some reserve of clarity or courage or simple human refusal to accept a lie at the moment when accepting it would become permanent. He stepped forward. He declared that the charges against the order were false. He declared that the confessions had been obtained under torture and were without validity. He declared that the order was pure, its rule holy, and its brothers innocent of everything that had been alleged against them. It was an act of retroactive courage, or perhaps simply the clarity that arrives when there is genuinely nothing left to lose, when the worst that can happen has already been decided, and the only remaining question is what you choose to say before it does. The commission recessed. Under inquisitorial law, the situation was legally unambiguous. A man who had confessed, been convicted, and then withdrew his confession, had relapsed into heresy. And relapse meant one thing: regardless of the circumstances that had produced the original confession or the courage that had produced the retraction. That evening, on a small island in the Seine called the Ile de Javiots, Philip IV had Jacques de Molay and Geoffrey de Charny burned alive. The chronicles that describe the scene disagree on the details, in the way that chronicles describing emotionally significant events always disagree the crowd. The light, the duration of the burning, the exact words spoken. The most famous tradition gives Molay a final statement summoning Philip and Pope Clement V to appear before God within a year to answer for what had been done. Whether he said it is impossible to verify, and historians treat the attribution with the skepticism that deathbed curses reliably attract. What is verifiable is that Clement V died within a month of the burning. In April 1314, of a gastrointestinal illness that had been deteriorating for some time. Philip IV died in November of the same year, following a hunting accident that led to complications the medicine of the period could not address. The coincidence was noticed by everyone and explained by each, according to their own theological commitments, divine justice for those who needed the story to contain justice, and convenient timing for those who preferred their history without supernatural intervention. The former Templars dispersed across Europe in the years that followed, their fates varying with the jurisdictions they inhabited and the choices available to them. Ordinary brothers received pensions and accommodation in former Templar houses that had been transferred to the Hospitallers. fading into the general population of former religious with the quiet anonymity of men whose institution had been destroyed, but whose lives, in most cases, continued. Some joined the Hospitallers directly, their military training and institutional experience making them useful to an order that had inherited Templar properties without inheriting Templar personnel in any systematic way. Some returned to secular life, the vows they had taken for life dissolved by the same papal authority that had originally accepted them. The institution was gone. The men it had made remained, carrying with them the habits of discipline and the memory of belonging to something that had asked everything of them and, for a time that felt longer from the inside than it appears from the outside, had seemed worth everything it asked. The dissolution of the Knights Templar did not produce the clean institutional ending that Philip IV had presumably envisioned, the sudden erasure of a network he found inconvenient, replaced by the quiet absorption of its properties into more manageable hands. What it produced instead was a dispersal of personnel, tradition, and institutional knowledge across the different kingdoms of Europe, each of which handled the suppression according to its own political circumstances, its own relationship with the papacy, and its own assessment of how useful the military order tradition remained to its specific strategic needs. The variations were striking enough to constitute a kind of natural experiment in how institutions die, or, more precisely, in how they sometimes do not die but transform, shedding the form that has become dangerous while preserving the substance that remains valuable. In France itself, where the arrests had been total and the proceedings most rigorously applied, the dissolution was as complete as Philip had intended. The properties transferred to the Hospitallers, the personnel dispersed, the Paris Temple stripped of its institutional identity and left as a building without the organisation that had given it meaning. In England, where the arrests had been conducted with considerably less enthusiasm by a crown that had its own complicated relationship with both the papacy and the French monarchy, the former Templars were treated with a leniency that reflected the absence of Philip's specific financial motivations. The proceedings found little of substance against them. Most received pensions. Some were assigned to monasteries. The institutional memory faded gradually, rather than being extinguished in a single morning. In Aragon, King James II created an entirely new institution, the Order of Montesa, formally established in 1317, specifically designed to absorb the former Aragonese Templars and their properties without the interruption that a simple transfer to the Hospitallers would have involved, preserving the continuity of personnel and local knowledge that made the military order tradition valuable in a kingdom still engaged in the active military business of the Reconquista. The most consequential survival, both for the institution itself and for the broader course of European history, occurred in Portugal, and it occurred with a directness and a documentary clarity that places it firmly in the category of documented institutional history rather than the romantic mythology that surrounds so many claimed Templar continuations. The Portuguese King Denis, navigating the suppression with the pragmatic intelligence of a ruler who understood that the military orders were strategically essential to a kingdom whose southern frontier with Muslim Granada remained an active theatre of military competition, refused to simply dissolve the Templar establishment in his kingdom and transfer its assets to an organisation based elsewhere. He negotiated with the papacy for the creation of a successor institution that would preserve the Templar personnel, the Templar properties, and the essential Templar functions under a new name that avoided the theological contamination of the French proceedings. The Order of Christ was formally established in 1319, recognised by Pope John XXII, and headquartered at Castro Marim on the Portuguese southern frontier, before eventually relocating to Tomar, the great Templar fortress and convent in central Portugal, whose architecture represents one of the most extraordinary institutional memories in stone that Europe contains. The Templar Knights, who became Knights of Christ, carried with them not only their military training and their familiarity with the Portuguese frontier, but something less immediately obvious and considerably more historically significant: 2 centuries of accumulated maritime and navigational knowledge developed through the Templars' extensive operations along the Iberian and Atlantic coasts, their management of the supply routes between European ports and the Holy Land, and their institutional engagement with the seafaring traditions of a peninsula that faced both the Mediterranean and the Atlantic simultaneously. When the Portuguese crown began its systematic exploration of the African coast and the Atlantic islands in the 15th century, the great project of oceanic discovery that would reshape the entire geography of human knowledge, it did so through institutions and with resources that carried direct Templar inheritance. Prince Henry the Navigator, who organised and directed the early Portuguese voyages of exploration from his base at Sagres on the southwestern tip of Portugal, served as Grand Master of the Order of Christ, the ships that felt their way down the African coast, that rounded Cape Bojador in 1434, that eventually reached the Cape of Good Hope and opened the sea route to India, sailed under the cross of the Order of Christ, a version of the Templar cross, recognisable to anyone who knew what they were looking at, carried on the sails of vessels whose voyages were funded partly by revenues from former Templar properties, and organised through an institution whose personnel included men trained in the military order tradition that the Templars had created and the Order of Christ had inherited. The Hospitallers, the order most directly enriched by the Templar dissolution, having received the largest single transfer of Templar properties anywhere in Europe, demonstrated through their subsequent history what institutional adaptability could accomplish when a military order found a new mission coherent enough to organise around. After Acre they had moved to Cyprus, then captured the island of Rhodes from its Byzantine rulers in 1309, establishing there a sovereign naval state that would defend the eastern Mediterranean against Turkish expansion for the following 2 centuries, with a professionalism that commanded respect even from the powers it opposed. When Suleiman the Magnificent finally took Rhodes in 1522, after a siege of 6 months that the Ottoman Sultan reportedly described as among the hardest military operations of his reign, the Knights of Rhodes, as the Hospitallers had become known, were permitted to evacuate with their arms and their dignity intact, a concession that acknowledged the quality of the resistance even in defeat. Charles V gave them Malta in 1530, and from that island the order resisted the massive Ottoman siege of 1565 in one of the most celebrated defensive operations of the 16th century, a victory that halted the western expansion of Ottoman naval power at a moment when the balance of the Mediterranean still hung in genuine uncertainty. The sovereign military order of Malta still exists today, recognised by the United Nations, maintaining hospitals and humanitarian operations across the world, the most complete example of medieval institutional survival available. A direct organisational descendant of the Hospital Brotherhood, founded in Jerusalem before the First Crusade had even ended. The mythology that accumulated around the Knights Templar in the 7 centuries following their dissolution is one of the most elaborate and most revealing examples of what happens when history produces a story that the human imagination finds genuinely insufficient, not because the story is uninteresting, but because it ends in the wrong place, with the wrong people winning, and without the resolution that a narrative of that scale and intensity seems to demand. The raw material that history provided was, by any honest assessment, extraordinary enough without enhancement, an institution that combined military power, religious vocation, international finance, and political influence in a single organisation, a dissolution so sudden and so violent that it left few survivors capable of defending the historical record, and fewer documents intact enough to settle the questions the trial had raised. A set of charges that included an idol whose name Baphomet was never satisfactorily explained, and that appears in no other contemporary source before or after the proceedings. A deathbed curse that appeared, within the year, to have been fulfilled with a precision that theology and coincidence competed to explain. A legal process so contaminated by political pressure that it produced a suppression without a verdict, an ending without a conclusion, a punishment without a proven crime. The legend began developing almost immediately. By the late medieval period, stories of hidden Templar treasure, of documents concealed before the arrests, of survivors who had escaped to carry the Order's secrets into perpetuity, were already circulating in forms that told you more about the needs of their audiences than about the historical realities they claimed to describe. Every generation since has produced its own version of the continuation of the story, that the story did not actually end on that island in the Seine in 1314, that something survived, that something was preserved, that somewhere the flame was still burning. Freemasonry's relationship with the Templar mythology is the most institutionally significant of these continuations and the most honestly examined. Modern Freemasonry appears to have developed in 17th century Scotland and England from the guild traditions of operative stonemasons, whose elaborate initiation ceremonies and hierarchical degrees provided the organizational template that speculative Freemasonry membership open to men who were not practicing stonemasons adopted and elaborated across the following century. The Scottish Rite, one of Freemasonry's major organizational branches, includes Templar degrees that explicitly claim a lineage running back through the medieval order, a claim that the documentary evidence does not support, and that serious Masonic historians have acknowledged as symbolic rather than historical. What the Templar mythology provided to Freemasonry was not a genuine institutional ancestry, but something more useful to an organization defining its identity, a ready-made narrative of ancient wisdom, secret knowledge, and persecuted virtue whose emotional resonances fitted the purposes of Masonic identity with a precision that made the connection irresistible regardless of its historical validity. The Masonic connection then provided a foundation for the 19th and 20th century conspiracy literature that extended the Templar mythology in directions that would have genuinely astonished Hugh de Paynes. Baphomet acquired in this tradition an afterlife spectacularly disproportionate to its actual historical significance. The word appears in the trial records in various inconsistent spellings, referred to by a small number of confessors as an object or figure venerated by the order, with descriptions so contradictory a human head, a skull, a bearded figure on a wooden beam, a cut, a combination of features that no two witnesses agreed upon, that the most reasonable conclusion available to a careful reader is that the confessors were describing something they had been told to describe, rather than something they had seen. Eliphas Lévy, a French occultist writing in 1856, drew Baphomet as a winged, hermaphroditic, goat-headed figure seated on a throne, combining elements of various esoteric traditions into an image of considerable visual power and zero historical connection to anything the Templar trial records actually described. This image, reproduced endlessly since Lévy published it, is what most people today picture when they encounter the word a 19th century invention mistaken for a medieval reality, with a persistence that speaks to the human preference for vivid images over accurate ones. The Holy Grail connection that various popular writers have attached to the Templars rests on no medieval evidence of any kind, and the specific claims advanced in the 1982 book Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and in the fiction that fed from it were examined directly against the available documentary sources and found to be inventions, not interpretations, not speculative readings of ambiguous evidence, but constructions built on documents that were themselves later proved to be 20th century forgeries created by a French fantasist named Pierre Plantard, whose relationship with historical truth was, at best, aspirational. This is not a case where historians are divided, or where the evidence permits reasonable disagreement. The specific claims were checked against the specific sources, and the sources did not contain what the claims required them to contain. The story of the actual Templars, the documented, verifiable, historically recoverable story is strange and dramatic and morally complex, and humanly rich enough to need no assistance from materials that have no basis in fact. What the mythology represents at its most honest level is a persistent cultural need for the story to have continued, for the treasure to have been hidden before the arrests, for the knowledge to have been preserved in some form, For the men who died on the Ile de Javiot to have died for something that outlasted them more completely than stone walls and financial mechanisms and the cross on a window in Tamar, that need is psychologically comprehensible in a way that does not require the mythology to be true. The dissolution of the Templars was an act of state violence against an institution that had dedicated itself, with whatever mixture of genuine conviction and institutional self-interest that human organizations always contain, to a cause the medieval world considered holy. The men who burned were by most reasonable assessments innocent of the charges that killed them. There is something in the human imagination that resists accepting that the story ends there with a corrupt king, a compliant pope, and an old man dying on an island in the river for refusing at the last moment to maintain a lie about himself and the brothers he had served beside for half a century. The castles are still there. Chateau Pellerin still rise from its promontory above the Israeli coast. Its enormous stones unbroken. The greatest Templar fortress never taken by assault, the Temple Church in London. Its nave, a rotunda modelled on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Its floor studded with the effigies of Templar knights in stone. Still stands near the Thames. The Manueline window at Tomar, covered in nautical imagery connecting the maritime heritage of the Order of Christ to the discoveries of the Portuguese explorers, still catches the Portuguese light every morning. The stone hands folded over stone swords are not going anywhere. The roads the Templars patrolled are roads now with different names, carrying different traffic. But the roads are still there, and the land is still there. And Jacques de Molay stood up on the last morning of his life and told the truth. And that too is still there, permanent as stone, in the record that history keeps whether we are paying attention or not.